The lower Danube basin in early 1944 formed a junction of resources, transport, and frontline pressure that none of the belligerents could ignore. Romania's alliance with Germany since 1940 had integrated the country's railways, ports, and oil sector into the Axis war economy. The oil fields around Ploiești and the refineries feeding the Danube barges and Black Sea tankers were tied to river ports at Galați and Brăila through standard-gauge spurs and depots. From there, convoys moved upriver toward Budapest and Vienna, or downriver to Sulina and Constanța. German planners regarded the Danube as an alternative to increasingly vulnerable rail lines, shifting bulk tonnage, fuel, grain, and ammunition onto barge strings pushed by tugs that could move day and night under escort. By winter 1943 to 1944, Luftflotte 4 and the German Army's logistical staffs treated the Galați-Brăila complex as a node whose disruption would ripple across Army Group South Ukraine. On the Soviet side, the recapture of the right bank Ukraine in 1943 brought forward airfields within range of the Danube Delta. The 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts, commanded by Rodion Malinovsky and Fyodor Tolbukin, advanced with integral air armies that could stage PE-2 dive bombers, IL-2 assault aircraft, and Yak and La series fighters onto newly prepared strips behind the front. Long-range aviation added Il-4 and B-25 medium bombers for night harassment and interdiction tasks. As the Red Army approached the Dniester and Prut lines between January and March 1944, planners identified the lower Danube logistics corridor, river traffic, oil depots, bridgeheads, and marshalling yards at Galați, as targets whose neutralization could complicate Axis redeployment to Transylvania and the Hungarian plain. Romania's armed forces entered 1944 under strain. The Royal Romanian Air Force fielded fighter groups equipped with IAR-80 and IAR-81 variants alongside Bf-109G6s received from Germany. Bomber and assault units operated CRS-79B, SM-79B, and JUU-88s, with reconnaissance elements flying IAR-39s and Bf-110s. The service was organized under Aeronautica Regala Romana, commands that coordinated with Luftflotte 4 through joint operations rooms in Bucharest and regional sector HQs nearer the front. Anti-aircraft defense around Galați combined fixed 88mm and 75mm batteries with 37mm and 20mm light guns on mobile mounts, supplemented by searchlights and acoustic posts. River defense felt the Romanian Danube Flotilla, which included Brăileanu-class monitors armed with 120mm guns, smaller gunboats, mine layers, and patrol craft. Their tasks were to protect shipping, maintain mine barriers, and enforce movement control on reaches where the river widened into multiple channels. German formations in the region reflected the transition from offensive to defensive war. Elements of JG-52 and other Jagdgeschwader rotated across forward fields when fuel and serviceability allowed, shielding river bridges and depots during daylight. Jews, 88, and a 111 crews of bomber units assumed night transport and mine-laying roles along the delta and coastal routes as Allied air raids against the Ploiești complex in 1943 had already forced dispersal of stocks and decentralization of refining output. By February 1944, German logistics officers prioritized barge convoys on the Danube to offset rail congestion caused by damaged bridges on the Siret and Prut lines. This policy increased the relative importance of Galați's harbor cranes, tank farms, and repair slips, concentrating targets within a few kilometers of dense urban housing. Soviet intelligence assessments for spring 1944 combined aerial photography with riverine reconnaissance. The Black Sea Fleet's air arm and coastal detachments mapped anti-aircraft batteries around the port basins and oil facilities, counted barge tows, and noted tugboat schedules that suggested nightly loading cycles. Reports to the Second Ukrainian Front emphasized the vulnerability of traffic transitioning from the maritime Danube channels into the river proper near Sulina, and up to the Galați Bend, where convoys slowed to negotiate currents and pilotage constraints. Staffs proposed coordinated pressure, harassed depots and marshalling yards by night to disrupt loading, then strike convoys during early morning when they were strung out in low-visibility mists common over the river in March and April. The population of Galați entered 1944 under blackout regulations, curfews, and periodic air raid alarms. Municipal authorities organized civil defense detachments to man shelters in factory basements and school cellars, distributed sand for firebomb suppression, and posted wardens in port districts where oil residues increased fire risk. The city's hospital system prepared additional beds and coordinated with military medical trains, staged on sidings west of the yards. Rumors circulated after the winter campaign in Ukraine about advancing Soviet forces. Rail refugees and wounded transits made the threat tangible. For residents, the Danube, traditionally a line of commerce, had become a line of vulnerability. Political calculations in Bucharest threaded between strategic dependence and growing fear of invasion. The Antonescu government maintained military cooperation with Germany while attempting to limit Romanian casualties after the defeats of 1933. Diplomats probed possibilities for a separate arrangement with the Western Allies, but the front's geography made any such bargain contingent on Red Army proximity to the Carpathians and the capital. For German leadership, Romania's loyalty was indexed to oil deliveries and the ability to keep Danube traffic flowing past Galați without unacceptable losses. For Soviet leadership, compelling a Romanian political break would be eased by military pressure that degraded Axis logistics, especially fuel. Weather and terrain mattered. The lower Danube in spring runs high on snowmelt, with shifting shoals that constrain navigation into predictable channels. Fog and low cloud along the river valleys limited high-altitude bombing accuracy, but favored medium-altitude PE2 groups and low-level IL-2 formations that could pick out rail sidings, tank farms, and tugboats. Conversely, these conditions aided defenders using radar-directed or sound-ranged flak to cue searchlights and box barrages over the port. In February-March 1944, both sides rehearsed their methods. Soviet pathfinders practiced timed flare drops over marshalling yards. Romanian batteries synchronized fuses for barrage belts at 2,000-3,000 meters, with 37mm guns reserved for break-ins at 800-1,200 meters. By the time the Uman-Botoșani offensive began in March 1944, forces in the lower Danube sector had defined their aims in measurable terms. Axis staffs sought to move specific daily tonnages of fuel and ammunition through the Galați-Brăila ports to sustain formations retreating toward the Târgu Frumos and Iași sectors. Soviet staffs aimed to reduce those flows by attacking rail approaches, storage depots, and the vulnerable river segment from Reni to Galați, while gaining air superiority in the sector by attrition against Romanian and German fighter groups. The lines on the map converged on the river bend and the city that dominated it. What followed would be fought in the air above warehouses and cranes, along embankments crowded with civilians and workers, and on the water where barges and patrol craft threaded the currents under guns scanning the same sky. At the beginning of March 1944, the front beyond the Prut and lower Dniester stiffened, and with it, the tempo over the lower Danube. Reconnaissance flights from Soviet air armies began to overfly the Delta and the Galați-Brăila corridor at dawn and dusk, flying staged routes from forward strips in southern Bessarabia and northern Black Sea littoral. The first phase did not start with mass bombing, but with registration. Paths across the city's rail fan, the tank farms west of the old harbor, and the river steps where tugboats assembled barge strings were photographed repeatedly from medium altitude. On the water, patrols of the Romanian Danube Flotilla tightened reporting procedures, obliging skippers to declare departure windows and convoy lengths to allow anti-aircraft batteries to pre-plot defense arcs. Operational decisions reflected compressed timelines. The 2nd Ukrainian Front's 5th Air Army moved small PE2 groups into range for daylight raids, while long-range aviation assigned night crews to harass rail approaches and freight yards. The 3rd Ukrainian Front's 17th Air Army coordinated strikes farther east to prevent diversion of air defenses toward the coast. Soviet planners treated the initial period as an air interdiction campaign linked to ground pressure north of Iași. Their orders set limited aims for each day. cut track at specified kilometer posts north of the port, ignite fuel storage in at least one depot area, and force at least one barge convoy to scatter or beach to avoid damage. Romanian and German staffs reacted by dispersing stocks, ordering rolling blackouts in port districts, and publishing revised unloading tables that shifted night labor to multiple smaller berths. Command structures clarified as the alarms multiplied. In Bucharest, the General Staff established a dedicated liaison cell to Luftflotte 4 for the lower Danube sector, with priority telephone lines to the regional flak command and the Danube Flotilla headquarters. In Galați itself, a joint operations room took over a school building in a central district, where Romanian army officers, naval officers, and Luftwaffe liaison personnel plotted raid tracks and convoy positions on layered maps. The Royal Romanian Air Force assigned fighter readiness sections with IAR 80-81s to forward fields within quick flight time to the city, while a detachment of Bf 119G6s from German units rotated in under a pooled maintenance arrangement to maintain a minimal alert pair during daylight. The outbreak of regular strikes was incremental rather than spectacular. On a cold, misted morning in the first half of March, a formation of PE-2s, escorted by Yak fighters, crossed the river line at medium altitude and released on the eastern classification yard. Bombs cratered 2 ladder tracks and set alight several wagons loaded with sacks and drums. Anti-aircraft batteries, already ranged, fired box patterns at 2,500 to 3,000 meters and claimed a break in formation. One PE-2 turned away trailing smoke, but the majority continued to the exit route south of the city. Later that night, IL-4s flew single or paired sorties, dropping small sticks aimed at the port lights that briefly flashed during cargo transfers. Their objective was not demolition, but disruption, to impose repeated halts that, multiplied over nights, would reduce daily tonnage through the node. Shipping practices adapted within days. Tug captains were instructed to consolidate Teius upstream of the city under the cover of embankments, move through exposed sections during prearranged windows under heavier escort, and if signaled by lookouts to slacken or cut lines, to let the barge strings drift to the edge of the channel until the alert ended. River monitors adjusted patrol circuits to overlap with the convoy windows, using their heavier guns to produce high-angle barrage fire aimed at deterring low-level runs against the waterline targets. Fires that did occur in the oil districts were met by pre-positioned pump trucks and volunteer teams drawn from factory shifts who had rehearsed hose laying between hydrants and river access points. Civil defense and municipal administration absorbed the new rhythm. Air raid sirens sounded with more regularity, and schools nearest the yards moved classes to interior rooms or suspended instruction when alerts exceeded an agreed threshold. Hospital directors posted staff rosters for night surgery and coordination with military medical trains. Shelter capacity was recalculated. Basements of administrative buildings were cleared to add places, and signage indicating nearest shelters appeared along tram routes. Citizen behavior changed accordingly. Evening foot traffic in the port districts declined, and workers carried small cloth masks to reduce inhalation of smoke and dust when fires or craters spread particulates across streets. The first week's raids generated decisions on both sides that shaped the next phase. Soviet staffs observed that flak accuracy improved as batteries learned approach patterns and that searchlights coordinated effectively along the river front. They modified routes, sending decoy pairs to trigger early warning and draw guns away from the main axis, and varied altitudes to exploit gaps between heavy and light flak envelopes. Axis commanders, noting that daylight convoy movements attracted shadowing reconnaissance, shifted some river passages to pre-dawn despite fog risks, and requested additional sound locators and light guns to cover low-level approaches over the water, where reflections complicated range finding. Key figures emerged within institutional roles rather than as personal narratives. Romanian battery commanders published corrected firing tables after backplotting shell bursts from recovered fragments. Luftwaffe liaison officers updated scramble thresholds to avoid exhausting fighter readiness on false alarms. Soviet Pathfinder crews refined timing of flare drops to extend illumination windows for follow-on bombers. None of these adjustments produced decisive results immediately, but together they defined the operating environment. A city where rail switches were repaired repeatedly, oil tanks were sandbagged and earthed, and river movements became calculations balanced between flow and exposure. Public sentiment registered fatigue more than panic. The population had experienced alarms before, but the steadiness of March and early April, with repeated nights of disturbed sleep and mornings of debris clearance, produced pragmatic adjustments. Shopkeepers boarded windows facing the yards. Tram schedules incorporated detours around damaged sections. Churches and civic groups organized relief for families whose apartments sat adjacent to targeted zones. The authorities published advisories reminding residents of blackout discipline, shelter etiquette, and the importance of avoiding crowds at river embankments during or after alerts, when unexploded ordnance posed continuing risk. By the end of this opening phase, the measurable effects were mixed but significant enough to alter planning. Track damage in the rail fan did not remove the facility from service, yet it reduced throughput during peak hours. At least one fuel depot suffered multiple ignitions, requiring extended pumping and cooling, which in turn required inventory rebalancing across smaller storage points. River convoys completed their runs with greater variability in timing, and some barge strings accumulated upstream, creating backlogs that demanded additional tugs and pilots. In the air, defenders recorded ammunition expenditure rates that exceeded initial allocations and requested resupply. Attackers logged aircraft serviceability rates affected by the sustained tempo from forward fields. The lines of effort had been drawn, concentrated defensive measures around a vital node, and a systematic effort to impose delays and losses. What began as reconnaissance and harassment had become a structured contest of planning cycles, where each side measured progress in repaired rails, refueled ships, sorties generated, and convoys that either reached the next bend on schedule or waited under the embankments for a quieter sky. Planning on both sides in April 1944 centered on measurable outputs rather than declarations. Soviet staffs framed the lower Danube as a logistics interdiction zone tied to ground offensives on the Iași-Targu-Frumos axis. The 2nd Ukrainian Front's 5th Air Army under Sergei Goryunov and the 3rd Ukrainian Front's 17th Air Army under Vladimir Sudets divided responsibilities to avoid saturating the same airspace. One prioritized daytime precision against rail and port nodes at Galați and Brăila. The other emphasized night disruption of approaches and river traffic east of the city. Long-range aviation, under Alexander Golovanov, assigned medium bomber regiments to supplement either front according to serviceability and weather. Air units were tasked with specific effects, stated in hours and meters. Cut mainline tracks for a minimum of 6 to 8 hours per 24-hour cycle. Disable at least 2 crane berths inside the harbor. Impose dispersal on barge convoys within a 10-15 kilometer stretch of river on any night selected for river strikes. Force packages reflected doctrine and available aircraft. A typical PE-2 bomber regiment with 24-30 serviceable aircraft could generate 2 waves per day if turnaround and runway conditions held. EL-2 regiments planned for low-altitude runs in elements of 4 to 6 aircraft, each armed with fragmentation bombs and rockets to damage rolling stock and lightly protected fuel infrastructure. Fighter cover, Yak-9s and LA-5s, was allocated by time block rather than sortie count, with patrols stacked to meet points of expected opposition near the city. Night operations relied on IL-4s and Lend-Lease B-25s configured for small stick bombing and illumination runs. Pathfinders timed flare drops to coincide with rail yard, switching windows observed during reconnaissance. Soviet logistics planning weighed the costs of forward basing. Advancing airfields around the Prut and lower Dniester required graded runways, fuel dumps, and dispersed revetments within range of Galați. Quartermasters defined targets for daily fuel deliveries in tons per regiment and tracked bomb expenditure against observed damage. Ammunition specialists calculated the proportion of delay and instantaneous fuses needed to combine crater formation with incendiary effects against oil stocks. Maintenance sections set thresholds for engine hours and propeller replacements that would cap sortie rates if not met. The staffs anticipated losses to flak rather than fighters in this sector, and therefore prioritized self-sealing tank checks and armor plate inspections on IL-2s before each mission cycle. Romanian and German staffs define success as throughput, not airframe tallies. The Joint Logistics Directorate for the sector budgeted daily movement of barge convoys and rail wagons as a matrix: number of tugs, average barge loads, crane cycles per hour, and sidings kept open for transshipment. For planning, they assume convoy lengths of 8 to 12 barges with average loads of several hundred tons per barge, escorted by patrol craft through the urban bend, where exposure to air attack was greatest. Schedules shifted heavier movements to hours of reduced visibility, trading navigational risk for lower detection probability. Danube monitors and gunboats organized patrol patterns to overlap convoy transits. Flak belts were plotted to create crossing fires above the harbor basins and the river entrance. Air defense planning combined fixed and mobile assets. Heavy batteries with 88mm or 75mm guns covered approach corridors at 2,000–4,000 meters. 37mm and 20mm weapons guarded low-level approaches and the river surface. Sound locators and available radar sets fed a control network that triggered searchlights and barrage timing. The Royal Romanian Air Force assigned ready sections of IAR 80-81s and BF-1J9G6s to fields within rapid reach, with scramble criteria calibrated to conserve fuel. Priority only when track plots indicated a raid vector penetrating to the port or rail fan. German fighter detachments rotated personnel and aircraft to maintain at least a daytime pair on alert, while conserving engines for engagements likely to intersect bomber streams rather than decoy pairs. Dispersal measures reshaped the target system. Oil companies shifted inventory from large tanks into multiple smaller containers protected by earthen berms and water curtains. Rail managers reconfigured classification patterns to reduce standing wagon densities. Workshops pre-cut timber for rapid cribbing of cratered tracks and stored replacement rails in stacks distributed along the approaches. Harbor authorities rearranged crane assignments so that even if 2 or 3 berths were disabled, secondary cranes could maintain reduced operations. Fire brigades trained mixed civilian-military teams in foam application on fuel fires and established hose lines, from river intakes to tank clusters at risk. Intelligence and counterintelligence factored into planning cycles. Soviet aerial photography built a catalog of gun positions, searchlight clusters, and probable command posts. Analysts marked heat shimmer patterns over roofs that suggested active boiler houses and, by extension, rail power dependencies. Radio traffic analysis plotted convoy departure codes and handoff phrases between harbor control and river patrols. Romanian and German countermeasures included dummy positions, decoy lighting during selected hours, and occasional false radio schedules to induce mistimed strikes. Camouflage crews painted roof patterns to mimic residential blocks and used netting to break up crane silhouettes. Propaganda and public information were instruments with operational aims. Soviet communiques emphasized strikes on logistics nodes to signal to both Axis authorities and Romanian civilians that the campaign targeted war infrastructure, not the city as such. Inside Romania, official bulletins reported successful defenses and rapid repairs, citing the resumption of traffic within hours to sustain worker morale. Both sides measured the effect indirectly. Whether absenteeism rose among dock workers, whether local informants reported increased movement of families out of exposed districts, whether barge captains requested changes in river insurance terms that would inhibit scheduling. Miscalculations appeared in the first weeks of sustained action. Soviet planners initially underestimated the adaptability of the flak network, which quickly tightened approach corridors with corrected fuses and interlocking fire. Daylight medium-altitude runs suffered from cumulative attrition that exceeded initial forecasts, forcing a shift toward mixed altitude and more night activity. Axis planners, conversely, underestimated the cumulative impact of repeated short disruptions. Even when track damage was repaired within hours, the stacking of convoys upstream and the ripple effects on tug allocation produced lag that could not be cleared without spare capacity that did not exist. Maintenance cycles for patrol craft lengthened as engines ran extended hours at variable loads. Each side adjusted doctrine. Soviet units increased use of time-on-target coordination to compress strike windows and saturate defenses briefly, accepting higher ammunition expenditure to achieve simultaneous impacts on cranes, switching points, and fuel handling. Fighter escorts stretched coverage with relay patrols, and reconnaissance added oblique photography to detect camouflage tank clusters. Romanian and German staffs expanded smoke generation around key berths, experimented with barrage balloons near crane tracks, and tuned night lighting discipline to reduce silhouettes against the river. Fighter controllers refined vectoring to favor high-side dives against departing bomber formations where fuel stayed allowed. By late April, the planning framework had matured into routines that translated into daily targets and nightly repair tables. The lower Danube corridor functioned, but with narrower margins. For the attackers, success meant a schedule of cut tracks, ignited depots, and convoys delayed beyond set thresholds. For the defenders, success meant wagons reclassified by dawn, cranes turning at reduced yet predictable rates, and convoy windows kept open. The contest moved from declarations to spreadsheets, tonnage moved versus tonnage denied, sorties generated versus serviceability preserved, shells fired versus batteries resupplied, setting the stage for broader escalation when ground operations pressed closer to the Prut and political calculations in Bucharest began to shift under military pressure. The first sustained engagements over Galați unfolded in early April as Soviet air staffs converted reconnaissance maps into sortie schedules. The opening daylight blow paired medium-altitude PE-2 formations with low-flying IL-2 assault groups tasked to strike different layers of the node within minutes of each other. A lead element of 1824 PE-2s approached along the Prut, leveled at 2,500-3,000 meters, and released on the eastern classification yard and the fuel handling spur behind the riverfront sheds. Ground observers timed the intervals between sticks to plot the formation's pace for future reference. Within 3 minutes, 812 IL-2s arrived in sections of 4, raking the outer sidings and warehouse roofs with fragmentation bombs and rockets designed to damage rolling stock, roof trusses, and lightly armored tank cars. Defenders answered with a plan refined during the March harassment. Heavy guns fired box barrages cut to timed fuses at altitudes matching bomber runs, while 37mm crews concentrated on the IL-2s as they crossed the river margin. A ready pair of fighters, often IAR-81Cs or BF-109G6s under a mixed Romanian-German alert, climbed to intersect the PE-2 egress. The disparity in numbers was typical. 18 to 24 attackers versus 2 per 4 interceptors in the first minutes, with another 2 fighters scrambled only if the raid vector persisted over the city. The calculus balanced fuel conservation and engine wear against the need to break bomber rhythm. On this first-day attack, 1 PE-2 fell away with a smoking engine after a head-on pass. Several IL-2s returned with flak damage to control surfaces. Track craters severed 2 ladder routes, and a crane cab near berth 3 took splinter hits that disabled its operator controls. Night brought a different pattern. IL-4s and B-25s flew in pairs at intervals of 15 to 20 minutes, their aim to force repeated alarms and prevent uninterrupted repair and loading. Small sticks targeted junction points where repair crews worked under shielded lamps. Searchlights caught one bomber long enough for heavy batteries to bracket. The crew jettisoned and turned south, clearing the city. The cumulative effect was modest in single events, but additive across hours. Shunted wagons stayed idle, and tug crews paused river coupling until sirens stopped. Civil defense logged shelter occupancy near capacity around the yards and riverfront, while districts deeper inside the city reported partial compliance with blackout measures that authorities tightened in subsequent nights. River traffic became a contested space. A convoy of 8-10 barges, each loaded in the range of several hundred tons, entered the bend at pre-dawn under patrol escort and the overwatch of a Brăila-class monitor. Soviet planners had scheduled a low-level run to coincide with this transit. 4 IL-2s, escorted by 4 LA-5s at higher cover, dropped to river height and released fragmentation loads along the towpath. Splinters holed the bow of a barge carrying drummed fuel. The tug, cut lines, to keep the column from bunching against the current. The monitor responded with high-angle fire, intended less to hit than to create a curtain that forced attackers to climb into heavier flak bands. Patrol craft guided the damaged barge toward the bank, while the rest of the convoy proceeded at reduced speed. This engagement illustrated the risk-reward calculation on both sides. The attackers exposed themselves to concentrated fire to disrupt a single flow segment. The defenders accepted navigational complexity and potential groundings to preserve convoy continuity. Unexpected outcomes shaped subsequent tactics. During an afternoon strike, bomb blast overpressure toppled stacked timber near a siding and ignited a localized fire that threatened a transformer hut not marked on earlier reconnaissance. Power to a section of the yard dropped, complicating switching more than the physical track damage did. Conversely, a nightstick fell short and detonated in a residential block bordering the industrial district, prompting an immediate review of approach headings and fuse settings by Soviet staffs and stricter blackout enforcement by local authorities to reduce target drift caused by light leakage. Both sides adapted within a day. Attackers adjusted release points and introduced time decoys to trigger searchlights away from main axes. Defenders refined smoke generation at key berths and deployed temporary blast walls made from cribbed timber and sand. Fighter combat remained brief and opportunistic. Interceptors sought high side passes against exiting bomber streams rather than prolonged dogfights that risk fuel exhaustion. In one encounter, two Bf-109G6s vectored onto a PE-2 element and scored hits on a trailing aircraft. Return fire wounded a pilot, who landed at a forward strip and was rotated out for treatment. On another day, IAR-81Cs descended on IL-2s, making a second pass and forced the assault group to jettison early. The ratio of aircraft engaged remained uneven, typically 6 to 10 escorts and attackers against 2 to 4 defenders over the city. But ground-based fire accounted for a larger share of damage claims than fighters did, a pattern consistent with the dense flak zones plotted along the riverfront. Repair and recovery cycles determined the operational tempo as much as lost statistics. Rail crews measured success by hours to reopen a ladder route, cribbing, ballast, replacement rails, and tensioning under portable lighting. Harbor teams rotated spare crane operators and used secondary cranes to clear debris from disabled berths, maintaining reduced throughput. Fire units logged foam consumption rates and replaced ruptured hose lengths cut by splinters. Hospitals reported case mixes dominated by blast and shrapnel wounds among workers, with civilian casualties concentrated in blocks contiguous with industrial targets. Ammunition expenditure for flak units exceeded peacetime training baselines by several multiples, triggering priority resupply requests routed through Bucharest. Soviet air groups compiled strike assessments with a conservative method. Photo confirmation of crater counts and visible fires. Observer logs of convoy dispersion, and, where possible, signal intercepts noting harbor control pauses. They noted that repeated daylight patterns allowed flak to pre-aim, so they varied ingress. Cross-river approaches from the southeast one day, upriver sweeps hugging cloud ceilings another, and occasional use of layered altitudes to complicate tracking. Long-range aviation crews shifted some effort from the city proper to the rail approaches 10 to 15 kilometers out, forcing defenders to stretch coverage and dispersing the risk to civilian districts. Civil life stayed tied to the operational calendar. Tram lines detoured around damaged sections. Schools in the port district compressed schedules to avoid hours most likely to bring alarms. Grain mills and oil handling companies reorganized shifts into shorter blocks with staggered start times to reduce crowding at siren hours. Municipal bulletins posted shelter locations, water distribution points, and rules for clearing streets, after all, clear to allow repair crews unimpeded access. Reports from local committees recorded steady compliance with blackout and shelter discipline, tempered by fatigue as alerts accumulated. By the end of the first fortnight of April, measurable outcomes for both sides were clear enough to adjust goals. Attackers could reliably cut 1 or 2 key tracks for several hours and ignite at least 1 storage area per active day, while imposing irregular delays on river convoys. Defenders could restore partial rail function before dawn, after night raids, and keep 2 to 3 berths operating despite intermittent damage, while moving most scheduled convoys through the bend, albeit with increased variance in timing. Losses occurred on both sides. Several attacking aircraft damaged or downed by flak over the city and approaches, a handful of barges and wagons written off, repair crews and civilians among the casualties. The engagements did not decide the campaign, but they fixed both coalitions to a measurable contest. Sorties versus repairs, tonnage denied versus tonnage moved, airframes serviceable versus guns supplied. The first clashes closed with neither collapse nor pause, only the tightening of routines that would govern the escalation to follow. Escalation followed a cumulative logic rather than a single order. By mid to late April 1944, staffs on both sides increased commitments to the lower Danube because delays recorded at Galați began to correlate with ground force supply fluctuations on the Iași-Târgu-Frumos axis. The 5th and 17th Air Armies expanded daily sortie allotments, drawing in additional PE-2s and IL-2s from regiments that had been rotating rest cycles farther north. Lend-Lease A-20 and B-25 crews were scheduled into mixed packages for night activity, combining illumination and small-stick bombing to complicate repairs. Fighter coverage thickened in timed blocks. Yak-9s and LA-5s occupied patrol boxes over rail approaches, while escorts rode shotgun for assault groups during ingress and egress. On days chosen for concentrated pressure, attackers aimed to sustain a tempo of 60 to 100 sorties, focused on the node and its approaches, subject to weather and airfield serviceability. Defenders responded with layered reinforcements. Additional light flak batteries arrived by rail and were sited to cover low-level avenues over the river's surface and the embankments where IL-2s tended to line up. Heavy batteries received fuse tables revised from back-plotted burst data gathered since March, tightening box barrages at altitudes mapped to medium bomber tracks. Barrage balloons were tested near key berths to force higher approach angles for low-level attackers. Fighter readiness increased by 1 additional pair during daylight windows forecast for attack, with rotation between Romanian IAR-81Cs and German Bf-10NG-6s to conserve airframe hours. The Danube Flotilla adjusted patrol densities along convoy windows and laid supplementary mine obstacles in minor channels to funnel traffic into lanes better covered by guns and searchlights. Weather and river conditions introduced constraints that multiplied under stress. Snowmelt and spring rains raised the Danube and altered currents around the city bend, slowing convoys and increasing the distance barges drifted when lines were cut under air attack. Fog banks at dawn shielded both attackers and defenders in different phases of an operation. Low clouds sometimes protected convoys, but it also favored low-level assault runs that were harder to track and engage. Repair crews had to crib track beds over saturated ballast. Harbor teams fought fires with water supplies affected by silt loads that clogged pumps. Soviet planners exploited breaks in weather to time concentrated efforts, while Axis staffs used poor visibility to push larger tows through the urban stretch at the cost of navigational risk and occasional groundings. Casualties mounted in patterns tied to role and proximity. On the ground, the majority of wounded were port and rail workers caught by fragmentation, while clearing debris or coupling wagons. Civilian losses clustered in perimeter districts bordering the industrial belt. Civil defense moved additional wardens and stretchers to those neighborhoods and redirected tram routes to keep traffic out of the repair corridors. In the air, damage reports from Soviet units continued to identify flak as the primary hazard, with fighter interceptions brief but costly when they occurred in the climb-out or egress. Romanian and German fighter units logged engagements typically involving 2 POW-6 defenders against escort groups of comparable or larger size, accepting that decisive dogfights were rare over the city due to fuel and altitude constraints. On the river, patrol craft crews faced shrapnel injuries during high-angle barrages and while towing damaged barges to the bank. Logistical pressure forced doctrinal adjustments. Soviet staffs recognized that repeated medium-altitude runs produced predictable tracks. They increased mixed-altitude stair-step attacks, placing timed salvos on cranes and switching points while Il-2s raked sidings and tug moorings. Air armies introduced time-on-target sequences to compress the defensive response window, accepting higher ammunition expenditure per target to achieve simultaneous hits across the node. Axis planners, having measured delays in hours lost to repeated short disruptions, prioritized redundancy. Oil inventory shifted further from large tanks to dispersed smaller containers within BERMED compounds. Auxiliary pumps and flexible hoses were staged to reroute around damaged manifolds. Rail managers set up pre-cut rail and pre-packed ballast pallets at intervals along approaches, aiming for restoration targets benchmarked in hours rather than days. Political and strategic tensions framed the crisis. Bucharest's leadership tracked repair and throughput reports alongside casualty and ammunition expenditure tables, aware that the sustainability of the sector bore on national policy options under discussion with Germany, and, cautiously, in channels seeking contact with the Western allies. For German command, the lower Danube's performance became a barometer of the broader Army Group South Ukraine situation. If river tonnage fell below planning thresholds, reserve fuel allocations to mechanized units north of the city would require rebalancing. Soviet High Command treated interdiction results as pressure points for political change, not just battlefield logistics. Staff memoranda paired reports of delayed convoys with situational summaries on Romanian morale and public order. Intelligence contests intensified. Soviet aerial photography captured the rearranged flak belts and the new distribution of storage sites. Oblique angles were added to detect camouflage nets over cranes and barges moored under embankments. Radio intercepts mapped convoy handoff phrases and the timing of harbor whistles used to signal movement in blackout conditions. Conversely, Romanian and German countermeasures expanded. False lighting at secondary berths during selected hours, decoy fuel drums in exposed yards, and occasional dummy barge strings staged to attract attention, while real convoys waited under the bank. Smoke generators were serviced to produce denser screens over the critical berths during predicted attack windows. International context exerted indirect effects. Allied bomber activity elsewhere in Romania and the Balkans forced Axis air and flak resources to cover multiple sectors, tightening ammunition allocations for the lower Danube even as the tempo over Galați increased. On the Soviet side, the demands of concurrent operations along the Dniester sometimes drew away bomber regiments slated for the port, leading to alternating days of heavy effort and days of reduced pressure that defenders used to clear backlogs and rotate crews. Neither coalition regarded the lower Danube as isolated. Its numbers, wagons reclassified, barges dispatched, tanks ignited, sorties generated, entered broader matrices that high staffs used to schedule or delay ground moves. Human systems adapted under fatigue. Harbor authorities enforced shorter, staggered shifts to reduce exposure during peak alert hours and to sustain throughput despite injuries and evacuations from frontline neighborhoods. Schools closest to the industrial district relocated classes to less exposed districts or moved instruction to midday windows when raid probability was lower. Hospital administrators increased surgical capacity by converting wards and organizing blood donation rosters. Civil defense rules hardened on issues learned through experience, prohibitions on gathering along embankments after all clear, mandatory checks for unexploded ordnance in courtyards bordering the yards, and penalties for blackout violations that had coincided with night raids drifting into residential blocks. Resource constraints emerged as a critical variable. Flak units reported ammunition usage rates that outpaced resupply schedules, compelling changes in firing doctrine, more emphasis on radar or sound-cued bursts, stricter fire discipline against decoys, and reservation of light-caliber ammunition for low-level attacks judged likely to threaten tugboats or cranes. Soviet air regiments tracked engine hours and airframe fatigue, rotating aircraft to rear echelons for maintenance while compressing sortie cycles on days selected for pressure. Fuel delivery to forward strips became an operational dependency. Road columns carrying aviation gasoline ran on schedules tightly coordinated with ground units to avoid bottlenecks at river crossings farther north. By early May, the cumulative effect of escalation produced measurable strain on both systems. Attackers could point to repeated multi-hour closures of key track segments, periodic ignition of fuel handling areas, and documented dispersal or delay of barge convoys over 10 to 20 kilometers river. Defenders could cite preservation of minimum daily throughput targets on most days, despite variance, and a record of keeping at least 2 working berths open even after concentrated raids. Losses accumulated without a singular decisive blow. Several aircraft downed over the approaches, multiple barges damaged or written off, cranes cycled out for repair, and flak guns replaced after barrel wear exceeded limits. The crisis did not resolve the contest. It sharpened its contours. The next phase would test whether a concentrated surge, timed with ground operations pressing toward the Prut, or a systemic defensive adaptation, redistributing flow and hardening key functions, would move the balance beyond attrition measured in hours, tons, and sorties. The peak arrived in early May 1944, when sustained interdiction over the lower Danube was synchronized with ground pressure along the Iași-Târgu-Frumos axis. On selected days within a 1-week window, the 5th and 17th Air Armies concentrated mixed packages intended to overload defenses through compression rather than mass alone. Morning strikes began with 20-30 PE2s in 2 waves aimed at the classification yard and the port crane line, followed within minutes by 12-18 IL-2s assigned to tug moorings, oil transfer manifolds, and the river steps where barge strings formed. Fighter cover stacked in 2 layers, Yak-9s or LA-5s riding above the PE2 altitude band, and a lower relay for the assault groups during egress. The objective was framed in measurable terms. Cut 2 ladder routes for at least 8 hours, disable 1 major crane and 2 secondary berths, and force dispersal of any convoy inside a 10-15 kilometer reach during daylight. Defenders committed their maximum available combination of guns, fighters, and river assets. Heavy flak batteries pre-range box barrages at 2,500-3,200 meters for the PE2 run-ins, while 37mm belts were set to cross over the river margin at heights used by IL-2s. Ammunition stocks were rationed by priority. Heavy calibers for bomber streams, light calibers reserved for low-level threats to the cranes and waterline. Fighter readiness increased to 3 pairs across the day's peak hours, typically a Romanian section on first scramble with IAR-81Cs, followed by a German WW2 pair, with a final mixed pair on fuel-conserving alert. On the river, a Brăila-class monitor and 2 gunboats established a moving flak corps around any convoy traversing the urban bend, timing their circuits to overlap the predicted strike windows. One of the heaviest sequences started under broken cloud, with ground haze over the water. The first PE2 wave released on the eastern fan. Craters severed a ladder route and warped a turnout. Splinters punctured tank cars on the fuel spur. 3 minutes later, the IL-2 sections threaded along the embankment, dropping fragmentation loads that tore roof trusses and damaged couplings on wagons positioned for transfer. Heavy guns bracketed the medium bombers. Light guns saturated the river edge. In the egress, 2 Bf-109G6s executed high-side passes, forcing a PE2 element to break and descend into a thicker flak zone. One attacker crashed short of the river after trailing smoke. Another limped east with a damaged radiator. The interceptors did not pursue far. Fuel planning and the standing order to avoid protracted dogfights over the flak belts kept engagements brief. Midday maintenance turned into a race against a second wave, scheduled as a time-on-target sequence. Repair crews cribbed under portable shields, sliding pre-cut rails into place and restoring one of the cut ladders within 4 hours. Harbor teams swapped operators into a surviving heavy crane and cleared debris from a disabled cab to expose electrical couplings for later replacement. Oil handling units rerouted flow from damaged manifolds through auxiliary pumps staged the previous month. Smoke generators along 2 berths produced screens that partially obscured the river steps. Barrage balloons forced IL-2s to approach at steeper angles on their next run, reducing accuracy but increasing exposure time inside the light flak band. Night absorbed the day's unresolved aims. Long-range aviation committed 8-12 sorties in pairs at 15 to 20-minute intervals against switching points and storage clusters. Pathfinders dropped flares timed for repair shifts. Searchlight tracks were tighter than in March. One bomber was held long enough for heavy guns to range. Jettisoned sticks fell across a siding under repair, forcing crews to withdraw and restart after all clear. The calculus of interruption, minutes lost multiplied by tasks queued, drove both planning cycles. Attackers logged delay estimates. Defenders translated those estimates into throughput tables for the following day's targets. Civilian impact reached its height under these routines. Municipal authorities recorded near-capacity shelter occupancy in districts adjacent to the port and yards. Hospitals expanded surgical shifts, added 20 to 40 beds by converting wards, and coordinated with military trains staged on sidings west of the city. Casualty reports for the busiest days showed a distribution concentrated among rail and port workers, blast and shrapnel, followed by residents of perimeter blocks bordering industrial zones. Civil defense shifted additional wardens to stairwells in buildings closest to the target belt, and enforced restrictions on re-entering streets before ordnance sweeps. Tram schedules formalized detours and inserted buffer intervals to accommodate sudden closures. Convoys became focal points for the peak phase. A planned tow of 10-12 barges with mixed cargo, drummed fuel, grain, and crated machinery entered the bend under escort at dawn, on a day predicted for heavy pressure. 4 IL-2s with 4 LA-5s above ran a low-level pass along the tow path. Fragmentation bursts holed 2 barges forward. The tug cut lines to prevent a concertina effect in the current. The monitor's high-angle fire created a curtain designed to compel attackers to climb. Patrol craft moved to push the damaged barges toward the bank. The tow reformed in 2 smaller strings and proceeded at reduced speed. The attackers claimed dispersion and delay. Defenders logged the passage as completed with variance. Both tallies entered the next day's planning sheets. For one side, evidence of interdiction; for the other, proof of continuity. Resource ceilings defined the crest. Flak units reported expenditure rates above resupply for several days in a row. Firing doctrines tightened, with ammunition reserved for runs assessed by observers as committed attacks rather than decoys. Barrel wear on some heavy pieces reached limits, prompting swaps with guns from less exposed sectors. Fighter units cycled airframes for engine checks after high throttle climbs and brief combats. Availability fluctuated between 2 and 6 serviceable aircraft per field at any given hour. Soviet regiments recorded serviceability dips after consecutive heavy days, rotating aircraft to rear echelons for propellers, tires, and control surface patching. Forward strips demanded additional fuel columns whose schedules had to mesh with road priorities supporting ground forces north of the city. Command decisions at the peak reflected trade-offs. Soviet staffs accepted higher daily bomb expenditure to secure simultaneous impacts across cranes, ladders, and manifolds, judging that compressed shock displaced more throughput per unit time than sequential strikes. Romanian and German staffs accepted navigational risk to push larger tows under fog and low cloud, on the understanding that groundings could be refloated, but destroyed, cargo could not be replaced quickly. In Bucharest, reports summarized the sector in paired metrics: convoys dispatched versus convoys delayed beyond planned windows, wagons reclassified per 24 hours versus rails cut and repaired, flak ammunition received versus ammunitions expended. In front headquarters to the east, Air Army logs matched those numbers with crater counts, confirmed fires, and photographic evidence of disabled berths. The human system adapted even as margins narrowed. Shift lengths were shortened again in the port and rail yards to limit exposure during predicted strike windows. Replacement workers were drawn from less exposed districts, with transport routed through back streets to minimize movement along embankments. Workshop crews pre-assembled electrical panels for crane cabs to reduce downtime after splinter damage. Volunteer teams drilled hose laying from river intakes to Burmed tank clusters. auxiliary pumps were rotated to distribute wear. Schools closest to the belt advanced examinations to vacate buildings for potential use as overflow shelters. Blackout discipline improved in the target districts, with fewer light leaks recorded by observers and fewer drifted sticks into residential streets during night raids. By the close of the peak period, the measurable picture stabilized at a high but unsustainable tempo. Attackers had achieved multiple multi-hour closures of key track segments within single days, temporary disablement of 1 to 2 crane berths per heavy effort, and repeated dispersal of convoys transiting the urban bend. Defenders had kept minimum throughput above the line required to sustain scheduled movements on most days, albeit with widened variance and increased backlog upstream. The cost ledger showed damaged and lost aircraft, expended stocks of bombs and flares, worn gun barrels, written-off barges and wagons, and rising fatigue across crews on both sides. No single blow broke the node. No single defense restored normalcy. The peak clarified the limits of compression and resilience alike, resetting expectations for the next phase, when each coalition would seek either a decisive surge timed to ground breakthroughs or a redistribution of flow that reduced exposure without conceding the river. Resistance and adaptation defined the period after the peak. For the defenders, the problem was to keep cargo moving despite predictable daily hazards. For the attackers, it was to sustain pressure despite wear on crews and machines. Romanian river authorities converted 2 tugboats with improvised armor, steel plates bolted over wheelhouses and sandbag belts along gunnels, to serve as leaders for barge strings through the exposed urban bend. Patrol craft mounted additional 13.2 mm, 12.7 mm mounts on improvised pedestals to improve arcs against low runs. Workshop teams welded splinter shields around crane cabs and fitted quick-change couplings on fuel manifolds so that damaged sections could be isolated and bypassed within minutes. Smoke units expanded capacity by adding mobile generators on flatbeds positioned at berths, selected each morning according to wind forecasts. Barrage balloons increased in number and were anchored along crane tracks and river steps to force assault aircraft to climb earlier and to compress their attack windows. Air defenses rebalanced doctrine. Heavy batteries lengthened intervals between salvos to conserve ammunition, while maintaining box patterns over approach corridors measured from back-plotted raid tracks. Light batteries shifted from continuous fire to short, cued bursts keyed to sound or searchlight acquisition. Firing tables were revised after each major raid, and gun layers drilled to change fuse settings rapidly when aircraft shifted altitudes. Radar, where available, focused on early cueing rather than continuous tracking, freeing searchlight crews to scan and hand off. Fighter controllers refined scramble logic to concentrate on egress points, where bomber formations were most likely to pass within range and fuel limits allowed a brief high-side intercept. On the Soviet side, air armies modified composition and timing. Assault groups added more rockets per aircraft to increase damage probability on short passes against moorings, tug clusters, and wagon lines. Some Yak-9s were tasked to low cover roles usually assigned to LA-5s, freeing the latter for brief high-altitude relief on escort lanes. PE-2 units experimented with varying stick densities, short, tight bursts for switching points and longer strings for yard fans, to complicate repair priorities. Night crews adopted irregular intervals rather than fixed 15 to 20-minute cycles, seeking to break the cadence that defenders had learned to anticipate. Aerial mining of approaches near the delta was considered and trialed in small numbers, where currents and channel geometry made recovery difficult, intended to impose routing constraints upstream of the city without large effort. Resource management became innovation's driver. With heavy gun barrels nearing wear limits, defenders rotated pieces among positions to share usage. Batteries accepted reduced nominal density at some sites in exchange for keeping more positions serviceable. The Air Forces faced the mirror image. Engine hour limits on PE-2s and IL-2s triggered rotations to rear depots, so staffs assembled mixed regimental packages so that no single unit carried the full burden on consecutive days. Bomb supply tables were recalculated to balance fragmentation, general purpose, and incendiary loads in ratios derived from confirmed effects in photographs and repair reports. When foam stocks for fire brigades tightened, harbor authorities shifted to water curtain, tactics backed by sand dumps pre-positioned for fast berming around ignited tanks. Improvisation extended to communications and control. Harbor signals were simplified to minimize light leakage. Coded whistle bursts and flag boards under blackout replaced some lamp signals during coupling and departure. River pilots worked from memorized bearings linked to shoreline features masked by smoke, adjusting tow spacing to reduce the chance of a cascading collision if a tug had to cut lines under attack. In air command posts, map boards gained overlays that tracked average repair times for specific targets: berth 3, crane motor, eastern ladder turnout, manifold junction 2, so that strike plans could weight effort toward elements with the longest restoration curves. Psychological strain accumulated in measurable behaviors. Absenteeism among dock and yard workers rose on mornings after heavy night activity. Municipal authorities and company managers responded by shifting more labor to midday windows and by establishing rest shelters closer to the work zones to reduce transit fatigue. Fighter pilots on both sides logged shorter tours over the sector. Replaced before, exhaustion produced errors that a dense flak belt would punish. Civil defense observed improved blackout compliance in the districts adjacent to the target belt, while neighborhoods farther away showed drift as fatigue encouraged rule bending. Wardens concentrated inspection in the inner ring to reduce the risk of scattered lights pulling nightsticks into residential blocks. Countermeasures and counters to countermeasures formed daily cycles. When defenders increased smoke, attackers introduced offset aiming, corrected by Pathfinder flares, dropped from angles chosen to light the sides of smoke plumes rather than their tops. When barrage balloons forced higher angles of attack, assault groups accepted fewer passes per sortie, but increased rocket salvos per pass, trading accuracy for saturation. Decoy wagon lines made from empty frames and tarpaulins absorbed some daytime effort until reconnaissance added oblique stereo pairs, capable of distinguishing shadows inconsistent with loaded cars. Dummy fuel drums drew attention until heat imagery from low obliques revealed inactive signatures. Thereafter, real clusters were prioritized. River tactics converged on risk budgets. Convoys were broken into smaller strings more often, typically 4-6 barges rather than 8-12, spaced to allow tugs to maneuver without transferring collisions down the line. This raised the number of tows and lengthened passages, but reduced the chance that a single hit or a single cut line would immobilize an entire convoy segment under the guns. Patrol density increased at choke points where navigation constrained movement. Monitors loitered in short drifts upstream of exposed sections to time their transits to overlap predicted strikes. Attacking air crews adjusted by targeting assembly points and tug moorings more aggressively, judging that disabling leaders at the start of movement impose greater delays than strikes along the towpath. Training adapted to the environment. Gun crews practiced rapid redeployment of light weapons to new angles based on misdirection raids designed to pull fire away from the main axis. Assault pilots drilled on single-pass discipline under balloon fields and smoke, with strict abort criteria if runs were misaligned. Night bomber crews refreshed instrument approaches calibrated to low beacons placed farther from the city to reduce predictable headings. Reconnaissance units added low-level photographic sweeps at slant angles to capture repair progress under roofs and netting, which vertical photographs missed. Information policy adjusted without abandoning operational security. Romanian bulletins to workers emphasized repair milestones, hours to reopen a ladder, number of convoys cleared in a day, against a backdrop of losses framed as within planning tolerances. Soviet communiques for grounded interdiction outcomes, confirmed fires, barge dispersals, rail cuts, while acknowledging flak density and weather as factors governing daily tempo. Both sides avoided inflated claims in official reporting for this sector, not from restraint, but because staffs needed accurate baselines to schedule aircraft, ammunition, and labor. By late May, adaptation produced a steadier but thinner margin for both coalitions. Defenders could move tonnage through the node on most days by distributing risk across time, space, and assets, yet each gain, an armored tug, a smoke generator, a trained relief crew, was offset by expended ammunition, worn guns, and a backlog of repairs postponed beyond immediate necessity. Attackers could continue to deny hours and ignite targets and to force dispersion on convoys, yet each increment of pressure demanded higher bomb expenditure, more complex coordination, and acceptance of attrition from flak that training alone could not erase. The campaign's center of gravity shifted toward a decision made not by a single engagement, but by a change in the wider theater, ground breakthroughs or political shifts, that would render the carefully balanced adaptations either adequate or suddenly insufficient. The turning point emerged not from a single raid, but from the intersection of air interdiction with a rapidly changing land campaign. In June-July 1944, interdiction over the lower Danube continued at a reduced but steady tempo, while ground forces of the 2nd and 3rd Ukrainian fronts pressed to the Dniester and mapped crossings toward the Prut. The operational calculus shifted decisively in August, when the fronts launched a coordinated offensive designed to break Army Group South Ukraine. While air units over Galați had been tasked to deny hours and tonnage, the larger plan now required severing the Axis system in Romania altogether. Sortie allotments and target lists were redistributed. Night harassment against the yard and port continued, but an increasing share of daytime effort targeted rail junctions feeding the city from the northeast and east, seeking to prevent reinforcement and to trap rolling stock inside the node. Force ratios in the theater widened. Soviet fronts committed several 100,000 men across the main axes, with supporting air armies capable of generating several hundred sorties per day in favorable weather. Opposing German and Romanian forces on the northeast, approaches numbered in the low hundreds of thousands combined, with air defenses stretched across multiple sectors and ammunition resupply under strain. The lower Danube sector did not contain the heaviest ground fighting, yet its numbers, convoys dispatched, wagons reclassified, fuel transferred, were indexed directly to Army-level movements north of the river. Commanders on both sides translated theater ratios into local orders. For the attackers, more weight on rail approaches and tug moorings to accelerate systemic effects. For the defenders, stricter prioritization of cargo types and convoy windows to preserve what could still be moved. On 20th of August, the first day of the coordinated offensive, reconnaissance reported large-scale artillery preparation along the fronts to the northeast. Within hours, Soviet air crews were briefed that interdiction strikes near Galați were to synchronize with rail cuts deeper in the network. Morning PE-2 waves focused on the eastern fan and the through lines that connected the port to inland depots. AL-2 sections targeted locomotives and switching points rather than warehouse roofs. Heavy flak responded with pre-range box barrages that had proven effective in April and May, but the density of strikes along multiple approach corridors forced batteries to split fire. A ready pair of Bf-1 SCG-6s climbed for a brief intercept over the egress, scored hits on a trailing bomber, and withdrew under fuel limits. The day's damage reports registered fewer warehouse fires but more stalled trains and disabled turnouts, which mattered more now that ground advances threatened to cut alternative lines entirely. River movements showed the same shift. Instead of routine mixed cargo tows, convoys prioritized fuel, ammunition, and rail components needed for emergency repairs north of the port. Tug captains were ordered to accept higher navigational risk in low cloud, to move during windows judged least exposed. Patrol craft and a monitor established continuous cover along the most exposed reach, but the multiplication of alerts reduced average convoy speed. Soviet planners exploited this by scheduling low-level runs, not at the bend itself, where flak had thickened, but at assembly points upstream and just beyond the urban stretch where smoke screens were thinner. 2 daylight passes forced barges to beach temporarily. Logs recorded multiple hours lost before reforming. The political dimension accelerated the turn. On 23rd of August, Romanian leadership announced a change of alignment and orders affecting cooperation with German forces. Operationally at Galați, the immediate effects unfolded as a sequence of communications and counter-communications. Romanian flak and river units awaited clarifying orders on engagement rules. Luftwaffe liaison officers requested confirmation of coverage arcs and fighter scramble protocols, harbor authorities paused some cargo transfers pending instructions on whether consignments consigned to German units would continue. For several hours, throughput fell below any prior day, not because of damage, but because commands were being rewritten in real time. That pause mattered as much as physical craters. Soviet staffs, interpreting reports of disrupted coordination, advanced timelines for additional strikes on rail exits and tug moorings, judging that uncertainty among defenders would multiply delay. German commands responded by attempting to extract critical stocks and personnel from the lower Danube corridor toward the northwest. Orders directed priority loading of fuel and munitions onto available barges and rail consists, with instructions to bypass nodes judged at risk of capture. Fighter detachments reassigned limited alert coverage to likely egress corridors rather than the port itself. In practice, this redistribution collided with existing damage and with new rules among Romanian units. A barge tow formed under mixed escort moved out of the bend, but paused again when upstream reports indicated contested control of sections of line and road along the intended route. The tow eventually proceeded in smaller strings, increasing exposure time. Soviet crews logged dispersal and delay, and photo reconnaissance captured emptying tank farms and idle cranes, not as a measure of defensive success, but as an indicator of a system being wound down under pressure. Civil and military administrations in the city experienced the turn as an administrative transformation. Air raid alarms did not stop immediately. Night harassment continued for several days to prevent rapid reorganization by any remaining Axis detachments. But civil defense orders shifted tone, from preserving throughput under fire to minimizing risk during a political and military transition. Shelter discipline remained strict, yet repair crews switched tasks from reopening all tracks to securing key sites and clearing routes for medical and administrative traffic. Hospitals prepared for a different influx, prisoners of war and displaced workers, while maintaining capacity for blast and shrapnel injuries until flight paths over the city changed. In air command posts, map boards were redrawn with new color codes to reflect changes in control. For Soviet staffs, the immediate question was whether to maintain the same level of bombing against a node that no longer served the same adversary logistics. Orders adjusted within a short cycle. Day strikes against the classification yard and crane lines were curtailed, while reconnaissance expanded to document abandoned stock, disabled equipment, and any demolitions carried out by withdrawing units, where withdrawal included attempts at destruction, charges set under turnouts, valves open to drain tanks. Repair priorities after the turn shifted again, from restoring Axis throughput to preventing environmental and urban hazards and preparing the site for new use. For German units still in reach of the lower Danube, the turn translated into retreat choices bounded by time and geography. Those with river access attempted evacuation by tow or by road toward bridgeheads upriver. Those without prepared to abandon material and withdraw with light equipment. Fighter detachments faced an arithmetic that allowed only a handful of scrambles. Flak batteries consumed remaining ammunition, delaying targets judged most likely to impose additional disruption on withdrawal. Losses in this phase differed from earlier months. Fewer engagements over the center of the city, more equipment scuttled or left in place, more barges moving empty to retrieve loads from upstream nodes that were themselves under pressure. Numbers summarize the turn's effect more starkly than any claim. In the last week of August, confirmed multi-hour cuts to through lines decreased because cutting was no longer the attacker's main requirement. The node's function as an Axis logistics hub was ending due to ground events and political orders. River convoy counts fell, not because all barges were destroyed, but because schedules were canceled or rerouted. Ammunition expenditure by flak units dropped as engagement rules were rewritten. Air sortie counts over the immediate node declined while reconnaissance expanded. Civilian shelter occupancy remained high during the transition days, and then decreased as alarms became less frequent and as industrial targets stopped operating on previous schedules. The turning point, then, consisted of a sequence: concentrated interdiction aligned with a ground offensive, a rapid political realignment inside Romania, an Axis withdrawal under mixed air and administrative pressure, and a shift in the mission over Galați from denial to documentation and control. For months, success and failure had been measured in hours of rail closure, berths disabled, barges delayed, and sorties generated. In late August, those metrics lost relevance for one coalition and gained a different meaning for the other. What had been a contest to keep or deny flow became a process of securing a river city whose role in the logistics map had changed in a matter of days. Combat operations around the lower Danube tapered off unevenly after the change of alignment on 23 August 1944. In the days that followed, Soviet air staffs reduced daytime bombing of the Galați node while maintaining reconnaissance and limited night harassment to prevent improvised demolition or removal of equipment by withdrawing German elements. Romanian commands issued orders to cease fire against Soviet aircraft and to coordinate with advancing ground units for handover of sites. Anti-aircraft batteries shifted to a guarded status, with ammunition tallies recorded and firing pins removed under supervision. Fighter detachments grounded or redeployed to fields outside likely approach paths. On the river, patrol craft maintained traffic control to separate military convoys from civilian craft, clearing the embankments. Barges previously used for fuel and munitions were inspected for charges or booby traps. Several were found with scuttling valves wired for quick opening and were secured before departure. Withdrawal by German units combined road, rail, and river movements under pressure from advancing fronts. Orders prioritized extraction of personnel, instruments, and portable stocks from the port and yard. Non-portable items, cranes with damaged cabs, fixed manifolds, rails packed for repair but not yet laid, were left in situ or rendered inoperable with limited charges. Rail engineers used small demolition loads on turnouts to slow immediate reuse. Valve wheels at some tank clusters were removed and taken along to complicate rapid reactivation. Where river extraction remained possible, tugs formed smaller tows of 305 barges to reduce vulnerability during the approach to less exposed reaches. However, uncertainty along upriver routes and bridgehead status forced repeated pauses and cancellations. By the end of August, most remaining German detachments in the near sector had either withdrawn northwest or surrendered to Romanian or Soviet authorities. Soviet ground units entering the city issued a sequence of directives typical of administrative takeover. Command posts cataloged infrastructure, cranes by type and capacity, pumps and manifolds by throughput, rails by gauge and condition, and flak positions with weapons counted for collection. Engineering detachments cleared obvious charges and inspected bridge piers, switch huts, and transformer yards. Medical units coordinated with municipal hospitals to stabilize the casualty load and to separate military from civilian cases. Security detachments established guarded perimeters around depots and the rail fan to prevent pilferage and accidental detonations. Checkpoints along main streets limited movement until ordnance sweeps reduced the risk of unexploded munitions. For Romanian authorities, the immediate aftermath was administrative reconfiguration under wartime conditions. Civil defense transitioned from nightly repair support to ordnance clearance, shelter cataloging, and population registry updates for workers displaced by months of raids. Municipal works departments inventoried damage district by district. Roof trusses over warehouses, cracked embankment sections, cratered streets adjacent to the yards, broken water mains feeding hydrants used by fire brigades. Rail and port managers presented throughput figures from the final weeks before the political shift, then produced initial estimates for restoration under new command. Labor rosters were revised as some skilled workers returned from evacuation, while others departed with withdrawing units or were taken into custody as POWs. Humanitarian consequences were immediate. Shelter usage decreased as alarms subsided, but housing shortages persisted in neighborhoods bordering the industrial belt, where splinter damage and fires had rendered blocks uninhabitable. Municipal authorities designated schools and civic buildings as temporary accommodations, and prioritized repair of windows, roofs, and stairwells to return a minimal number of apartments to use before autumn rains. Food distribution remained organized through ration centers that had functioned during the spring campaign, with adjustments to cover demobilized workers and families returning from rural shelters. Health departments recorded spikes in respiratory illnesses associated with dust and smoke exposure during the heavy months, then a gradual decline as debris clearing operations advanced and as open fuel spills were contained. Mine and ordnance hazards dominated the technical profile of the withdrawal phase. In the port, engineers located scuttling charges, delayed action bombs that had failed to detonate, and aerial delivered fuses embedded in dock surfaces. Along rail approaches, small craters concealed fragmentation that impeded ballast replacement until magnets and sweepers cleared the lines. On the river, channel surveys detected moored mines laid earlier in the season to protect the urban bend. Recovery crews marked and lifted them to clear navigation. Safety protocols slowed the resumption of normal traffic, but prevented additional casualties. Reports from September documented the clearing of dozens of dangerous items across the port and yard complex, and the reopening of sections of track to controlled military traffic before full civilian use. The economic transition unfolded in stages. In the short term, the port and rail yard operated as military logistics nodes for the advancing fronts, moving supplies inland and receiving captured equipment. Formerly, Axis-designated fuel and grain flows were redirected under Soviet supervision. Tank farms were inventoried, and residual stocks were allocated to military priorities. Repairs focused on functions with the highest ratio of throughput to labor, restoring one heavy crane to full service rather than partial repairs on several smaller units, clearing a single ladder route to feed 2 working berths rather than attempting to reopen all tracks simultaneously. By late September, measured daily throughput rose from near zero immediately after the turn to a fraction of pre-campaign levels sufficient for operational needs, with targets stated in tons per day rather than the larger volumes recorded earlier in 1944. Comparative assessments during the withdrawal give perspective to the preceding months. For the Soviet side, interdiction had achieved consistent delays, forced dispersion of river convoys, and imposed measurable repair burdens without destroying the node outright. The political shift and ground breakthroughs then removed the node from Axis use altogether, achieving the strategic results through combined pressures. For the Axis, defenses had preserved reduced throughput for months under attack, supporting sectors north of the river until the larger theater balance changed. After 23 August, those measures could no longer serve their original purpose, and the task became extraction and denial of equipment to the adversary. Romanian forces occupied both roles across the timeline, initially as defenders in cooperation with the Luftwaffe and Danube Flotilla, later as administrators and partners in the handover and reorientation of the city's logistics. Casualty accounting in the aftermath emphasized totals by category rather than a single headline figure. Port and rail workers comprise a significant share of those injured or killed during the heaviest weeks, followed by civilians in perimeter districts and military personnel in flak, patrol, and fighter units. Hospitals recorded month-by-month tallies suitable for planning convalescent care and for estimating the labor pool available for reconstruction. Loss reports for equipment, barges written off, cranes disabled and later repaired, locomotives destroyed on sidings, entered compensation and requisition ledgers that would influence budget decisions after the front moved west. Public memory began to take shape even as repairs continued. Municipal bulletins summarized the timeline from March through August in practical terms: days of closure, hours to reopen key routes, number of alarms, while appeals for volunteer labor framed clearance and rebuilding as necessary to restore normal traffic and to prepare for winter. Official statements avoided attributing motives beyond operational necessity, consistent with the administrative tone maintained during the campaign. Families returned to apartments near the port under inspection protocols. Shopkeepers reopened in blocks where glass and doors could be replaced. Tram service extended to more lines as streets were patched and embankment sections stabilized. By early autumn, the withdrawal and immediate consequences had yielded a new operating pattern. Galați no longer functioned as an Axis logistics hub. It served instead as a controlled node in a network supplying advancing forces. Air raid frequency over the city declined sharply, though reconnaissance continued. The river carried fewer mixed civilian commercial tows and more military-designated convoys under supervision. Rail flows increased within a controlled schedule, with priority given to movements supporting crossings and pursuits farther west. The aftermath was not a return to pre-war normalcy, but a measurable reconfiguration. Infrastructure still scarred by months of strikes, a population adjusting to reduced alarms and ongoing repairs, and command posts whose maps now measured logistics in a direction reversed from the one that had defined the spring and summer. The legacy of the Lower Danube contest in 1944 rests on how a regional logistics node affected and was affected by theater decisions. In operational terms, the months of interdiction over Galați demonstrated that sustained air pressure could degrade throughput without destroying infrastructure beyond near-term repair. The measurable outputs, hours of rail closure per day, berths disabled, convoys dispersed, never collapsed the node by themselves, but they tightened margins at the same time that ground offensives eroded alternatives upstream. When the August offensive opened and Romanian alignment shifted, the prior attrition translated quickly into systemic effects. Stocks were lower, crews were fatigued, schedules were brittle, and the decision to withdraw or repurpose the port could be executed in days rather than weeks. For Soviet staffs, the sequence validated interdiction as a method that produces decisive results when synchronized with land operations and political change. For Axis staffs, it underscored the risk of depending on a river corridor under hostile air, while rail bridges and road nets were already under stress. Strategically, the contest illustrated how a mid-sized city with a port, rail fan, and river bend can influence campaigns far from its streets. In spring and early summer, the node's reduced yet continuing output helped sustain formations on the Iași-Târgu-Frumos line. After the August turn, the same infrastructure supported advancing fronts in the opposite direction. The conversion required days of inspection and clearance rather than months of rebuilding, precisely because the earlier air effort had forced dispersion and repeated repairs rather than catastrophic ruin. The downstream effect on the fuel availability was significant at the level of planning matrices. Daily tonnage targets were revised, convoy lengths shortened, and tug cycles lengthened, with consequences that propagated along the Danube and into depots north of the river. In that sense, the history of Galați in 1944 belongs to the broader story of how rivers functioned as wartime arterials, whose capacity rose or fell according to the interaction of air power, engineering, and command coordination. Civilian and municipal legacies are visible in administrative records rather than commemorative language. The experience of nightly alarms, shelter usage, and debris clearance generated standardized procedures for blackout enforcement, ordnance sweeps, and rapid cribbing of cratered streets. Hospital rosters and blood donation schedules became templates for later emergencies. Fire brigades documented foam consumption, hose wear, and the effectiveness of water curtains against oil fires, producing practical guidance for ports handling petroleum cargo. Schools and tram lines learned to operate around variable closures with detours and modular timetables. These habits outlived the campaign and shaped post-war civil defense doctrine, where plans for river cities included inventories of basement shelters, sand depots, and pump placements derived directly from 1944 practice. For the Romanian Armed Forces and Administration, the episode's legacy is dual. In the first half of 1944, Romanian units operated within a German-led defensive framework, sharing flak data, fighter alert cycles, and river patrol patterns while trying to preserve national assets. After 23 August, many of the same institutions executed a controlled handover, documented stocks, and assisted in reorienting the node to supply advancing Soviet and Romanian formations. The continuity lies in procedure, cataloging guns, ammunition, cranes, and rails, enforcing movement control, and managing mixed civilian-military flows under pressure. The discontinuity lies in command relationships and aims, which shifted within days. This duality influenced later assessments in Romanian military literature, which preserved detailed technical accounts of flak densities, repair times, and convoy management, while placing political interpretation within broader national narratives of 1944. For German commands, the campaign's after-action reports fed into a lesson set about river logistics under air attack. Reports emphasized the value of dispersal, smoke, barrage balloons, and armored tug leadership. The limits of relying on flak alone against mixed-altitude time-on-target attacks, and the cumulative strain caused by short, repeated interruptions rather than single heavy blows. These findings reappeared in later analyses of the Rhine and Oder in 1945, where similar problems confronted staffs attempting to move fuel and ammunition under Allied air supremacy. The Danube case added a constraint specific to the lower river: fog, channels, and the need to protect both maritime access and inland flows, which restricted where defenses could mass. A technological legacy lies in the interaction between aircraft types and target sets. PE-2s achieved consistent damage against yard ladders and crane lines when flak boxes were less dense. IL-2s were effective against tug moorings, wagon lines, and lightly protected oil handling points, but were vulnerable on second passes. IL-4s and B-25s imposed cumulative delays at night when intervals were irregular. On the defending side, 88mm and 75mm guns determined survivability at medium altitude, while 37mm and 20mm weapons set the risk envelope for low-level assault runs over water and embankments. Barrage balloons and smoke did not stop attacks, but they altered geometry enough to reduce accuracy and to increase exposure time inside the light flak band. These empirical relationships informed post-war manuals on port and river defense and on urban logistics interdiction. Economic outcomes tied the city's wartime experience to reconstruction. Because infrastructure was degraded rather than obliterated, post-turn restoration could prioritize high-throughput functions. One heavy crane returned to service yielded more immediate benefit than the partial fixes across multiple small units. A single reopened ladder route paired with 2 working berths restored a measurable fraction of daily capacity. In the months after the front moved west, throughput targets were set to military needs first, then expanded to mixed uses as stability increased. Budget ledgers recorded the costs of replacing barrels, hoses, rails, and barge hulls. Compensation tables for destroyed private property and municipal facilities extended into the post-war years. The economic legacy was thus both a burden and a starting point, with the city's role as a logistics node preserved rather than erased. Memory and commemoration evolved after the war, according to changing political frameworks. Early narratives emphasized the August realignment and the city's rapid return to function under new command, with lists of repairs and reopened lines presented as proof of administrative competence. Later accounts integrated the months of air activity into broader histories of the 1944 campaign, often focusing on the August decision and treating the spring and summer as preparatory. Technical monographs, flak dispositions, river patrol logs, repair shop records retained more granular detail and became the sources for scholars seeking to reconstruct the sequence of events and to quantify effects. Discrepancies in casualty and damage estimates remained, reflecting wartime record loss, differing counting methods, and the overlap of civilian and military categories. The historiographical legacy is therefore plural. Operational, technical, administrative, and political threads coexist, each with its own evidentiary base. At a wider scale, the case contributes to debates about the effectiveness of air interdiction against urban logistics under contested skies. Galați shows that air power can force dispersion, impose delay, and raise costs decisively when linked to ground advances and political shifts, but that it rarely yields immediate collapse in isolation. It also shows that civil defense, repair capacity, and redundancy can preserve minimum flows for months, shifting rather than erasing the line where a system fails. In war histories of 1944 in southeastern Europe, the city's experience connects riverine warfare to rail and road networks, and air to administration, with outcomes measured less by single battles than by tables of tonnage, hours, sorties, and repair cycles. The final significance of Bloody Galați 1944 lies in its layered character. It was an air campaign above cranes and ladders, a river campaign among tugs and barges, a civil campaign of shelters and repairs, and a political campaign decided in headquarters and ministries. Each layer shaped the others. The city did not decide the war's outcome, but it translated theater dynamics into daily metrics that influenced decisions far away. That is the measure by which its legacy endures, a demonstration that infrastructure, when contested, becomes both an objective and an actor, converting strategy into numbers that determine what armies can attempt and what populations must endure.